Hey everyone, we're going to go over the plants today, and I will just start off by saying we do have a short unit at the end of the course, which is really reduced because we are in summer school and it's a short timeline, but we will talk about the plants again. I did have a few people asking me about what from this course is useful for grade 12. Certainly, the plants are very useful because in grade 12, in the metabolism unit, you'll do a whole chapter that is just on photosynthesis. So, what I've done here is try to make it as useful as possible for those of you taking the grade 12 course. But of course, we are talking about the kingdoms here. So, we want to know what sets the plants apart from every other group. So the biggest thing that we're going to talk about today is photosynthesis. So I'm sure that in grade 10 at some point you've seen this equation, which is CO2 and water forming oxygen and glucose, which is a food source. And so many of the things I've listed here I think are pretty common sense, which is basically why do we even care about the plants? Okay. The big thing I want to mention in this section, because we, as I said before, are going to talk more about it in the last section, animals really have relied on plants to allow us to move to land. And the really big reason why, in addition to all the things we use them for, is that they produce lots of oxygen for us. And as heterotrophs, we need that oxygen and also that sugar to be able to actually survive. So I want to go into what are the characteristics of plants. They are all eukaryotes, which means they have a nucleus and special organelles. They also have cellulose in their cell walls. So with the fungi that we learned about earlier, the fungi don't have cellulose. Instead, they have what's called chitin. Okay, chitin is also a carbohydrate, but it's made differently. Okay, so cellulose is that for plants. In number three, it got a little bit weird here. I'm not sure how that happened, but it should say plants carry out photosynthesis using the pigment chlorophyll. Now, this is the part where I was saying it's sort of important a little bit to understand this for next year. Chlorophyll is essentially a what we call pigment. It's able to absorb energy from sunlight. And in doing that, with many other steps, which you will learn next year, it's able to change that sunlight energy into chemical energy. And what I mean by that, chemical energy, is the energy that's stored in bonds. And in this little corner here, I have a picture of glucose, which is one example of a monosaccharide, a very simple sugar. So what we are doing in photosynthesis, and it does take lots and lots of steps, which will take a long time to teach in grade 12, is essentially taking that sunlight energy and then basically formatting it into something that can be used by animals as a food source. Okay. And just to mention a last one, all plants are also multicellular. So with some of these, like the protists and the fungi, we said it could be multicellular, but it also could be unicellular. For plants, they must be multicellular. So we'll talk about a little bit later in the course is that plants have specialized cells, just like animals have specialized cells. So that they can do whatever functions are needed for a much larger organism. So a little bit about classification. I had mentioned in the protist lesson that the protist is thought to be the very first eukaryote. And protists are sometimes, many times, photosynthetic. So from that first photosynthetic protist, we started to see over millions and millions of years new traits evolving. So just to mention right here, these green boxes, these are what we call derived traits. So what the evidence points to right now is from that early protist, which was a green algae, these traits started to develop. And we're going to talk about in the evolution unit, how do they come to be? These are basically started by a mutation to the DNA. So the mutation basically allowed, in this example, a plant to become vascular, which is to start to develop xylem and phloem tissue. So we're going to talk a lot more about this concept later. But what I wanted to show in here was that it's taken many, many millions of years. We're talking about 500 million years to go from that unicellular algae into the plants that we have today. So just to mention a few of the types here, we have non-vascular plants like the bryophytes. Those are things like mosses. So things that grow like flat on the surface of something, those are non-vascular. Seedless vascular plants, those are things like ferns and so forth. Gymnosperms, we're thinking of things like pine trees, for example. And finally, angiosperms developed the latest, which is flowering plants. So anything that you see that develops a flower at any point in its life cycle, those would be considered angiosperms. And we'll talk more in the last unit about reproduction in plants. That's really sort of the goal of a flower is for reproduction. So more about that to come later in the course. Um, just a couple more things I want to mention, and I'll come back to the evolution down below. Initially on Earth, it's thought to be that everything was covered in water. And so over time, the plants obviously have moved somehow from water onto land because today we see them on land. When they were in the state of algae, they would have been aquatic organisms, but over time, like I said, long times, 500 million years, for example, they started to move off of the land. So what I've done here is list the 5 things that they needed in order to grow on land, and I call those adaptations. Adaptation is essentially something that helps you to live in a given environment. So I'll give you an example. Cacti. Cacti grow in really hot, humid environments, which is why they have that really thick skin that's very waxy. Okay, that would be an example of an adaptation that helps them in their environment. So if we're thinking of a plant moving from the water onto the land, it's going to need some help actually retaining water for itself. So the first one I have here is formation of the embryo protected in a seed. So think about seeds that you even buy from the store. They remain in that package for a really long time. They're like dried up seeds. And yet, when you plant it in your garden, it's able to somehow grow. So the embryo and the seed is what allows that to happen. We also see them growing straight upward, and that is helpful for photosynthesis. Likewise, tissues like the xylem and phloem, they're basically tubes running all throughout the plant up and down, which are allowing the plant to actually transport water to where it's needed. Then comes the water loss one, which I was speaking of earlier. We have a cuticle, which is the wax that's surrounding it, creating a waterproof barrier. So again, even plants that we have in Canada where it's not super hot and humid, they'll still have that waxy surface. They'll still feel sort of waxy. Again, the goal there being to prevent water loss, especially in the summer, for example, where easily water can evaporate. Similar here is the stoma and guard cells. You're going to find these on the bottom of the leaf usually, and these are opening up to allow CO2 in, allow oxygen out. So in addition to that, they're also going to be able to close when the plant needs to retain water. So they are really, really important for that. And last but not least is strategies to spread their reproductive cells. I was mentioning just earlier the flower. Well, the fruit is actually one such strategy, which is used to spread those seeds out. So if you think about the fruits that we get, they're usually very sweet. They are energy dense, right? They are something that if we eat it, we're getting lots of sugar from it, even if it's not the sweet kind of sugar. So in doing that, we animals are actually helping the plant to spread out its seed because, of course, the plant itself is sessile. It's stuck in its spot. But having a really tasty fruit is able to actually get those seeds further away and hopefully to reproduce. The last thing that's on this little lesson here, I'm really just summarizing what we saw on the first page. So what are the actual adaptations that helped each of these groups to evolve? Now I'll just mention here, I put approximate time periods What I'm looking for that you understand is just the timeline. So we go from very simple organisms that are like flat on the ground, all the way up to angiosperms, which have developed these nice flowers and helping them with reproduction. I mentioned here also the fruit part, which is helping for the plant to actually get its seeds out into the wild. And last but not least, because I was mentioning it with the fungi lesson as well, was just this idea of a life cycle. So for animals, I've mentioned previously, we have diploid body cells, which each has two sets of chromosomes. So that is one set from each of our parents. With the exception of our egg and sperm cell, those have to be haploid to make sure the next generation gets the intended number. Plants, though, they have a really weird pattern. They can be diploid, they can be haploid, or they can be what we call polyploid, which means they have many sets of chromosomes. And if you think about examples like bananas and strawberries and those types of fruits, many of those are polyploid. They might have like 6 or 8 sets of chromosomes rather than just 2 sets of chromosomes. And part of why that's happened is that humans have started to manipulate different fruit and vegetables basically for our own purposes. Like we can get really nice big strawberries if we modify the amount of DNA that they have. And likewise with something like bananas, if you've ever noticed when you cut open the cross section of the banana, it looks like there are the seeds, but they're sort of like almost gone. That has to do also with this polyploidy. We've essentially modified the banana so that it doesn't have seeds because most of us don't want there to be seeds in there. So I'll just mention, just to finish us off, this little section, it's really just warming us up for the next unit. It's not something we have to spend a great deal of time on right now because the second unit on genetics, we're going to go into a lot more details about this information.